Welcome everyone to another Fireside Chat, and today I have a very special guest, Carolynne Maguire, who is a Notary Public with Maguire Company. I have you prominently displayed behind us if anyone would like to look up your company and read up on you. I've known Carolynne for many, many years. She is a Vancouver expert in notarial services and as well as conveyancing in Vancouver. And today we're going to start on a very interesting topic that I'm sure you get asked a lot about, certainly I do, and that's co-owning property in BC. Mm-hmm. And I guess the first question is, what are the options for co-owning property in BC, Carolynne?
Well, you've got essentially three for co-owning, three options. I would say joint tenancy, which comes with a right of survivorship, meaning that if one of the joint tenants were to pass away while co-owning the property, their interest is extinguished in favor of the surviving joint tenant or tenants, without it having to go through probate or through their estate. In other words, that right of survivorship is somewhat automatic and just needs to be updated at the land title office with a death certificate.
Right.
Okay, so simple, but it does come with some conditions or strings attached.
Because I'm joint tenant with my wife, which is fairly common.
It is.
What are the strings attached?
Well, you've already met them. It's not a problem, but it does require equal ownership.
Right.
So whether it's 2 or 10,
okay,
the joint tenants to an interest in the property have to own an undivided equal interest with each other.
Makes sense.
Okay. So another alternative is tenancy in common, which means that you can have any reasonable fraction of ownership as your interest, but whatever your interest is when you pass away, it goes into your estate. So it forms part of your estate. It's going to be distributed per your will at the time of probate. Okay. So you've got those two. But the third really is the combination of those two. And that gives you quite a few options because you can be joint tenants with others as to a particular interest in the property, which then could be sort of tenants in common with another interest in that same property. And that other interest could be a single person or a corporation or other joint tenants.
So one of the joint tenants could be broken down into tenancy in common. Is that what you're saying? Because I've never actually run across that. It's very interesting.
Okay, well,
I'm learning something here.
Well, to be clear,
yeah,
just think of the tenancy in common as almost kind of like a firewall. So any entity or group who are sort of owning a particular interest. Can be tenants in common, like that firewall, with another entity or group.
Correct. Okay.
But within a group, if they want joint tenancy, they have to be equal owners. Very interesting.
Very interesting. And that makes total sense. A little more complex than I think what a lot of people would be thinking.
True.
From a client perspective, what we run across is typically spouses are joint tenants.
Yes.
Right? My wife and I are joint tenants on our property. God forbid something happens to your partner, the property automatically, maybe I'm using that incorrectly.
No, I think of it that way too.
Yeah, goes to the surviving spouse's name without going through probate.
Right. That's the benefit.
That's the benefit. Whereas if I have a couple of investors or 3 or 4 investors purchasing a property together, they don't necessarily want their portion of ownership to go to the other owners if something happens to them. Then it's tenancy in common.
Right.
Correct? And that could be any breakdown.
Yes, as long as it adds up to a full, 100%.
Right.
Ownership.
Okay.
And you have to think of it in terms of fractions, actually, for land title purposes. They don't use percentages. So not to say that you can't reduce any percentage essentially to a fraction, but if you have a repeating decimal or something like that, you are going to have to at some point turn it into a fraction.
So it could, sorry to interrupt, but this is really interesting because it could be as tenants in common. It could be 32/57ths of ownership, but it must be a fraction. It can't
as long
be
as you end up with a full
percentage.
57/57, you'll be fine.
Okay, exactly. As long as they all add up. Very interesting. Okay, that's good.
Yeah.
So, but typically joint tenants, it could be father son, mother daughter, anything like that. But typically for spouses, only 2 people on joint tenancy.
No,
correct?
no.
It could be more.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, there
There's
you go.
not a limit to how many joint tenants are in a group.
Okay.
2, 3, 4, doesn't matter.
Interesting.
The rules still apply, though, that when a person dies, their interest is extinguished in favor of the surviving of the joint tenants in the group.
Excellent. Okay, that's good to know. Whereas tenants in common, the person who's expiring, their portion goes to their estate.
Correct.
And then goes through probate.
That's the idea.
Okay, very, very interesting. Is it a good idea for an aging parent to add a child to their title? That's a loaded,
question.
to avoid probate.
That comes up a lot.
Because we get asked that a lot as well. Yeah.
And honestly, the answer is it depends.
Right.
Very specific.
Right.
To the facts of the individual situation.
Okay.
And one that requires a great deal of thought and professional advice before you take that step.
Right.
Because it can have control issues.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the parent is used to doing whatever they want, whenever they want.
Mm-hmm.
Now they need other signatures if there are other people on the title.
Right.
It goes to tax consequences, potential capital gains concerns,
Mm-hmm.
which I'll elaborate on in a moment.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, this is done with an estate plan in mind, but if you have more than one child and you're only putting one child on with you, you're creating a potential kind of minefield of disagreement and trusts that are implied and things like that need to be thought out beforehand.
Yeah.
So, as I said, I would go back to the tax consequence just to use a simple example.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go with the simplest example. So, say it's decided that in this particular family, it's a good idea. There's a parent and a child. One child, no siblings, nothing. It's just the 2 of them are all they have for each other.
Right.
Okay, so that's lends itself more so, to that circumstance where it might be a good idea. They get along, everybody's in agreement. But the parent lives in the home and the child does not.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now remember, the joint tenancy requires equal ownership.
Mm-hmm.
So now they're 50-50 owners
Mm-hmm.
in a property. Well, if the property were later sold or upon the death of the parent,
Mm-hmm.
all of a sudden, if enough preparation wasn't made in advance, the child could be faced with a potential capital gains tax. Now, I'm not an accountant, so no financial advice or...
Of course. But that makes total sense because the gain begins once you're on title. Right?
That's the thing, is as soon as the child has gone on title, if it's in an appreciating market,
right.
If they haven't prepared for that possibility, then they are exposed to that. And there are ways, though, that you can prepare.
Okay.
Okay. Now, again, without getting into accountant territory or anything else, what I would encourage anyone who's interested in that sort of arrangement is to look into bare trusts. Okay. Now, that in itself opens up a whole other, discussion about the Landowner Transparency Act and other documentation that would be involved. But this is why I say, in answer to your initial question, it requires good advice, have it all thought out, because the documentation needs to be done before the title is changed.
Right.
Okay? It needs to be very well planned out with all the what-ifs. So as I say, the control, the tax, but also the estate planning. And, under circumstances not as simple as that one, where we have now siblings.
Yes.
Okay, what if we have, 3 siblings? And, mom is, I don't know, 87 years old. So they think, well, let's prepare. And mom's on board, thinks this is a great idea, but she can't choose one. She wants to put them all on, and all this other. Now, two of her children have their own children.
Right.
Okay. Well, if people don't pass away in the anticipated order, it could completely change the estate plan if, again, the what-ifs haven't been considered. Because if, let's say, the daughter who has children passes away before mom,
right,
she's no longer on title to that property.
Right.
Because it's cut and dried,
Yeah.
It's a two-edged sword, that joint tenancy.
Yes,
right?
yes, she's out.
She's out.
Yeah.
And that means that any flow through to her children that might have come had the property been in the will, it could have skipped over and gone to her grandchildren.
Very interesting. That's such a good point.
I guess what I'm saying is that there are so many what ifs.
Yeah.
And then what if any of them were in an accident and now mentally incompetent?
Yes.
Have they got powers of attorney in place?
Yeah.
Life has many twists and turns, and you can't anticipate all of them. But
well, it's so interesting because really the underlying theme, and you'll see this in many of our fireside chats, is do your due diligence before you make the offer. And in other words, talk to your accountant, talk to your lawyer. Your family planning must be done prior to writing the offer because, as you said, it depends. And everybody's situation is very different. And I know we have clients, we're actually sitting down where we usually discuss this earlier in the buyer's meeting in detail, different types of ownership and so forth, and we alert them to talk about this. But sometimes in some circumstances, people write an offer they just come across, we're sitting down, we're preparing the offer, and then we talk about, are we going in tenancy in common, or are we going joint tenants? And they say, well, what do you think? Well, it depends. It's a very in-depth discussion, and it's not just with your realtor. It should be with your estate planning advisor, whether that's your accountant, your lawyer, both. Really important to do that before with co-ownership. And there's tax implications, etc., that warrant that kind of in-depth discussion prior to making the offer. So very good points, and those are great examples that you came up with. The one daughter
real
was
life
the children.
Examples.
They're real life examples. So under what circumstances might one want to reevaluate the type of co-ownership that they currently have, and would property transfer tax apply to it? Because that's another discussion, is the property transfer tax, depending on how you are on title.
Yes.
Let's touch on that a little bit.
Okay, well, again, this does come up a lot because I would say the most common reasons, other than someone passing away and the natural sort of restructuring of the title taking its course, there are often relationship changes that will trigger either wanting to add your new partner onto title with you, or the opposite, meaning people are going their separate ways and they've made arrangements, who's going to own the property and make a decision about whether they sell the property outright or whether one of them wants to stay on title alone.
Got it.
So those are the kinds of examples for relationship changes. Obviously there are many more, but those ones, I'd say relationship changes are probably the most common. And the answer about property transfer tax on that, again, it depends.
It depends, yeah.
There are exemptions under the property transfer tax for exemption code 15 is where it is a transfer pursuant to a separation agreement.
Okay.
So it would behoove any couple who's wanting to have one owner on the title instead of two, to have gone through that process with their family law guidance to result in a separation agreement of some sort that's acceptable to the property transfer tax people, because it will actually be submitted in support of that exemption being claimed.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
So that's a way where property transfer tax wouldn't apply if those conditions are met to a change in ownership. Okay.
Interesting. Okay.
Let's look at adding someone to title.
Yeah.
So there's exemption code 5, where if
You've got all the codes memorized?
Oh, well, you know, I've been doing this 35 years.
Wow, I'm impressed.
Even though they do change things on me every once in a while.
I told you she was good.
No. These are, as I say, you know, people in our industry will know these.
Of course.
Like the back of their hand. But one of the conditions for exemption code 5 is, you know, it's a transfer to a related party.
Okay.
But of an interest in the principal residence. Okay, so say you take on your wonderful new partner, you are now considered spouses under the property transfer tax after, you know, 2 years of living in a marriage-like relationship, or you've actually become married. You now are related parties. Okay,
right.
But it has to be your principal residence for at least 6 months. So if you have 5 properties and you're only living in one of them, then the other 4, I don't know of an exemption.
No, they're investment properties.
They're investment properties.
Absolutely.
So you'll have an exemption for the principal residence if you meet those criteria.
Right.
And a funny thing about related parties.
Yes.
Brothers and sisters aren't considered related parties.
Correct.
It's really just your lineal descendants from sort of grandparents down through children and, you know, whatever.
But not cousins, spouses. Not aunts, uncles, grandparents down to grandchildren,
and spouses.
And spouses.
That's it. And you have to meet the criteria as a spouse. So these are you know, common misconceptions about, you know, siblings being related.
Right.
Well, of course, you know, around the, you know,
I can't just
the dinner table maybe, but not to the property transfer tax.
Yes, yeah, that's really interesting. And I remember that because I went through a family transaction with my brother, and property transfer tax was applicable. And this is many, many years ago. Of course, I know this now. But it's surprising because a related party is not your sibling. That's right. So it's, again, very specific. And the tax applies in that particular case. So the exemptions must be a linear descendant. That's a very good, or spouses.
That's right. Those are the main categories.
Very interesting.
But, you know, I always recommend before you do anything, you know, you run this all past your professionals.
Absolutely.
And have it all figured out first before you do any actual transferring.
Yeah, do your research.
But another one that I find shocking is that if you are joint tenants with a non-Canadian,
right?
You've done this because you're partners. Your expectation would be the right of survivorship. Okay. This is an example of why you might want to reevaluate ownership when the government changes the rules on you.
Right. I know where you're going.
Okay.
Foreign home buyers tax.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
So when that was introduced, it wasn't really communicated very clearly, I don't think, that people who were sharing ownership with non-Canadians weren't grandfathered. So we actually, you know, had circumstances, and I'm sorry, I don't know my way around it, but, you know, a Canadian gentleman passes away, his longtime spouse, who's an American citizen, you know, the transmission is done to the surviving joint tenant based on his death certificate. There is an exemption from the basic property transfer tax.
Correct.
For the survivor, you know, the transmission to the surviving joint tenant.
Which is provincial.
This is all provincial. This is the property transfer tax.
Okay.
Okay, so when a transmission is done to the surviving joint tenant, generally there is an exemption. You don't pay property transfer tax.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
But that's not the same as the additional 20% tax that they like to call the foreign buyers tax, but it's called the additional tax.
Right.
And this poor widow, having lost her spouse, is now going to have to pay 20% of the market value, the current market value of the half interest that she doesn't already own.
And she's got to come up with that money.
She's got to come up with that money.
Wow. Fascinating.
I know. And so
wow.
That's an example of why you have to remain vigilant about how your assets are structured.
Yes.
Because had she known that in the past, the option she might have at least considered as a couple, that's when they could have maybe considered, reducing her interest or taking her off the title, or these other options should have at least been considered. I'm not saying that there was one right answer for everyone, and they certainly should get proper tax advice.
Right.
Because the flip side is you have to be careful that you're not doing something, that would be considered under the property transfer tax to be tax evasion. But this is what I mean about being advised by your tax expert when the rules change. What should we do?
Yes, and there's lots of rule changes coming up. So this is very good advice. When a new program or tax comes up, it's very important to reevaluate how your title is structured. Absolutely, and see your professionals and get good advice, because that could mean that you will need to make a change in order to avoid a surprise like that. And that's a very nasty surprise. She's
devastated, obviously for the loss of her husband, but also she doesn't have that money. She doesn't have that money liquid or ready.
Right.
So she's probably going to have to sell the property.
Wow.
Just to pay the tax. And
that's newsworthy.
Oh, it's sad.
Right, but it should. I mean,
I wonder if that's a human interest story.
It's a human interest story, and I wonder if that's an oversight from the government when they announce a new policy, or is that just something that they're aware is happening and they're just turning a blind eye to? It's very interesting because that's a real life story, and it is sad. That's really unfortunate. And that comes down to my final question on this: when should your form of co-ownership be decided? And it's very clear, we've touched on this a few times, well before you make an offer. It's extremely important to see your accountant, to see your estate planning lawyer, to get proper advice based on your situation before writing the offer and coming to see Carolynne to do the conveyance, because we're kind of like the third and fourth stop in the process, and it's really important to get all your ducks in a row well before then, so you're making the right decision. This is really good discussion we had here today.
Well, it's great in theory, and I totally agree with you, but here's what, of course, happens in real life.
Right.
Is that the plan is made that the new home buyer is going to take title either in their own name or as a couple. But then the bank has other ideas.
Right.
And sometimes for qualification, they ask that a parent or some other, person whose financial stability is desired by the bank is added to title.
Right. They're a co-signer, etc., and they must be on title when they co-sign. Right.
And that's a new thing relative to my being in practice. It used to be that co-signers didn't have to be on title. You could be a covenantor or a guarantor and co-sign for the financing without having to be on title. But some years ago, that shifted.
Right. And
now you're seeing lenders all the time, even though they don't stipulate a minimum amount of interest, they do want some guarantor or covenantor to be on the title, to some extent.
Right.
So that opens up a whole other discussion.
Yeah.
Because now you'll have to get an amendment to the contract because of Section 20A, restricting assignment.
Yeah.
I can't add someone to title at closing, just
willy-nilly.
Unilaterally.
You can't just paste it in there.
Can't just do that. So it takes a step back. It involves the seller now. We have to
Yes.
So
we've run into that.
Sometimes with all good intention, we still, at your stage and mine, are having to assist with how the end result will be.
Absolutely.
Because now we have to talk to our clients about how you know, it's great that Marty has got the addendum adding dad onto the contract, but now we need to talk about how is dad going to co-own that property with you?
Right, right.
So, I'm not going to get into specifics now, but we've kind of touched on the options. That then becomes a discussion with their conveyancing professional.
And we're getting more and more of that now, with the rates being where they're at, where you might have very easily qualified for a certain home in a certain neighborhood 18 months ago. But today, at today's rates, it's much tougher to qualify for what you need. So we're seeing a lot of parents and helping out, or grandparents helping out on title, and that's a really important thing to discuss with your professionals beforehand, is how does that person go on title?
Yes,
that's great advice.
And are they going to require independent legal advice?
Right.
Which is fairly straightforward these days. It's you might as well consider it an expectation.
Absolutely.
Because if they're taking such a minor interest in the property, and their only function of being there at all is at the behest of the lender, then it's likely that your conveyancing professional will be asking them to get independent legal advice. So it's an additional cost.
Yes. Wow, you've opened up so many areas that, you know, we see it up to a certain point, but when you're dealing with that conveyance end, you must have every eventuality taken care of ahead of time. And I know life doesn't always work that way. So sometimes you're scrambling at the last minute for people to make the correct decisions. So the best advice, I think, if I could summarize from this whole discussion, is spend the time up front and figure out exactly what is the best formula for co-ownership on a property based on your circumstance. There's no simple flow chart to follow. You've got to sit down with the right professional ahead of time and make those choices. And for financing, last topic we just chatted about, if somebody is going to co-sign, also speak with the professional. How does that look in terms of the co-ownership? Are they going to be a joint tenant, a tenancy in common? And what are the repercussions of those with various eventualities? So these are discussions that are very important to have well before we write that offer on the great home that you're going to be buying. Great advice. This is a good discussion. We went into really, really good detail. I appreciate you coming and chatting with us on this topic.
My pleasure.
Carolynne Maguire from Maguire Company. What a great, great discussion. Thank you very much for joining us again. And thank you for joining us for this discussion on co-ownership. We'll have many other topics that we're going to introduce you to, and Carolynne is a great resource for that. Thank you.
Thank you.